what do we do when we need to go past what LiveView gives us? He has been doing Elixir for more than a decade. He's a pilot and a parent of 4, with one of them developing Elixir on the day-to-days. Successful parenting in my book. Chris Nelson is here today to talk us about LiveView and custom elements.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to LiveView and Web Components. My name's Chris Nelson. You can find me mostly on Blue Sky these days at superchris.launchscout.com, or you can find me on GitHub as superchris. So just introducing myself briefly, I am the co-founder of LaunchScout. We are a web and mobile custom development shop out of Cincinnati. I'm the creator of a library called LiveElements, which is all about making the integration between web components and LiveView just a little bit more ergonomic. I'm also the creator of another library called LiveState, which I'm not going to get into as much today, but if you're interested in that, come find me afterwards. I'm also a contributor to WASMX, which is all about WebAssembly and Elixir and a whole other topic. Again, if you're into that, come find me and I'll nerd out about that with you in the hallway. But what are we going to be talking about today? I'm going to try to keep it moving fairly quickly because 25 minutes is super short. But I'm going to briefly make the case for why I think web components and LiveView work well together and why web components I think are a good way to extend LiveView. I'm then going to go into how to use them together and what the challenges are. I'm going to introduce LiveElements and show some examples of how it works, and we'll go through a demo of all the things I'm talking about. And then finally, I'll talk about like some gotchas, some rough edges that you might run into along the way. So I'll go ahead and get into it. Just to define some terms, what even is a web component? Technically, the web component spec is actually an umbrella spec of 3 different other specifications. But the one that you probably and I care the most about is really custom elements, or how to write custom HTML elements. There's another spec under the umbrella called the shadow DOM, which is super interesting and powerful, but trying to dig into it deeply, we won't really have time. And then there's also template elements, which are, we're not really going to talk about. I think custom elements in particular are a really good option for extending LiveView. I think one of the best reasons is that they are built into your browser. All the code that you use when creating a custom HTML element is provided directly by your browser. No third-party libraries of any kind are required at all. And that means they're future-proof. We all, if we've done any front-end development, we've seen JavaScript frameworks come and go and come and go and come and go. But you can probably still call functions on document that were there 20 years ago. And that's going to be the case for custom HTML elements as well, because they are built into the browser and well supported by all the browsers and have a W3C spec behind them. This browser integration also means they have superpowers that you just can't do with a plain old JavaScript. I'm not going to dig into the shadow DOM deeply, but it gives you a level of precise control over the appearance, but also gives you the ability to let the user style your element with plain old CSS to precisely the extent you decide is right. There's also integration with the browser at the level of forms. So if you think about building a custom element that you really want to be an actual form input. It used to be if you're building a form input in JavaScript, you have some sort of hacky hidden input that you then have to manage and deal with. But now there are actual specs in the browser to be able to implement your element to actually integrate it as a proper form input. So another example of things you just can't do without the level of integration with the browser that custom elements have. I also think it's the cleanest interface with LiveView, and that is just because like a custom HTML element at the end of the day is an HTML element. And what does LiveView do at the end of the day? Mostly, it renders HTML, right? So HTML, it all works together. All right, so let's talk about using a custom element. In its simplest case, it can be absolutely as simple as you add the JavaScript definitions that define the custom HTML element, and then you use the custom elements on your page because it's just an HTML element. And in some cases, that may be all. That may be all you need to do. You know, congrats, the talk is over, you can go home. I mean, it can be that simple, and I'll show you an example where, you know, I do that in a little bit. But in some cases, you may want a little bit more integration between LiveView and custom elements, and that basically is going to fall into two different categories. How does LiveView talk to or send data into a custom HTML element? And how does LiveView receive data from a custom HTML element? We'll talk about the first one first. And basically, the easiest way to go there is just to pass data into a custom HTML element as attributes. So get it off the assign, just put it in as an attribute the same way you would any other HTML element. You can also, in some cases, pass data in via child elements. Just to, you know, state what might be obvious, but it's something to keep aware of. Your custom element needs to be aware that, hey, when its attributes change, it might need to re-render. That's not like built in out of the box, but it's very easy to do, and there are libraries to make it even easier to do that, but it is something to do. And then how do you deal with complex data? Let's like, you know, more complex than a simple value you can put in an attribute, and there I generally find that JSON serialization is a good choice. Of course, you know, that you can get out of control amounts of data, but I've generally found that even for what I would consider like pretty large honking chunks of data, I can still stuff them into a JSON attribute and have things work out fine. And we're doing that in production, and that's been okay for us. All right, what's the other side of the story? How does an element communicate with LiveView? And the best option that we've found for that is custom events. And a custom event, if you haven't seen that or dealt with that before, it is an actual DOM event. You just get to make it up yourself. You get to give it a name, and maybe more importantly, you get to define the payload. There's a detail property of a custom event, and you can put in there whatever you want. Now, something to point out, LiveView natively out of the box does not know about custom events. So right now, I do have a NPM that you can use called the Phoenix Custom Event Hook that will easily let you tell LiveView about your custom events, and then at that point you just write handle event code that you would for any kind of event in your system. I do hope that Phoenix Custom Event Hook is a temporary thing. I do have a PR open against LiveView to actually integrate proper support for custom events into LiveView itself. That's kind of been sitting for a bit. I'm not sure quite what's going to happen there, but you know, I'll definitely keep trying to push that along as however I can. But for now, you have an option with the NPM, and it works just fine. So with all that said, LiveElements is then a library to automate some of the things I just described. And it is a hex package, of course, and the main thing it gives you is a custom element macro. And that custom element macro is a declarative way to produce a functional component wrapper around a custom element. And that functional component wrapper will do two things for you. It will take care of serializing any data that's beyond just a simple primitive value as JSON for you when it sends it along. And it will also let you declaratively specify, here are the custom events that I care about, and then it will take care of wiring them up to the Phoenix Custom Event Hook and sending them, so you don't have to do that work yourself. All right, so let's dig into our first demo and see all the things that I just described in action. And if anything I'm saying is like unclear, feel free to interject with questions along the way. I should have said that earlier. All right, So here is our demo. Let me bump the font a little bit. And this is just a really simple app to choose your favorite airport. He mentioned I'm a pilot, so I will type in the description or a few characters of my favorite airport, which is the one I fly out of in near lovely Cincinnati, Ohio. And that is Butler County Regional Airport. And so I have a little autocomplete guy. That autocomplete that you're looking at right now is a custom element. And then when I choose an airport, the map and the marker are both custom HTML elements, and the backing code is all LiveView. So that's a little demo, pretty small, but let's like break it down and show how all the pieces of it fit together. Okay. So the first thing to talk about, that autocomplete input that we just saw. For that, we are using LiveElements to give us a functional component wrapper. We saw kind of how it worked. It starts in a closed state, and then it sends two events. Well, it sends many events, but there's only two of which we actually have decided to care about in this application. That is the event for searching. So once you've typed a few characters into that autocomplete, it comes up to LiveView, and LiveView filters and sends back the airports. And then the commit event is when the user has chosen an airport. So the items themselves for the airports, they're passed in as an attribute, and then LiveElements will take care of serializing them as JSON. Interestingly, that open and close state, we have decided for the purposes of this app, we don't care about that, so that's entirely client-side state. We could actually send events up and manage that in LiveView if we needed to, but we don't. But it's just kind of an example of, it may sound really easy to say, like, LiveView is just going to manage all of the state for our application, but if you really think in detail about any application, there's always some amount of state that's actual client-side state and is never going to make sense to have up beyond the server. An example of this would be like a select element. Well, the fact that you've clicked on that select element and you're now seeing the options appear, technically that is state, but you would never say like that would be in LiveView. So anyway, just some of the things that you got to think about as you kind of build apps like this. So let's talk about how that custom event even gets dispatched out of the element. And this is like one of the few examples of JavaScript code, I promise. But this is just like to show you what does a custom event being sent look like. And we're just calling dispatch event. We create a new custom event, autocomplete-search. We give it the detail property, which really just has the query, as in what did they type, and the name of the input. So if there was more than one, we could tell which one. Let's talk about the map elements next. There are several of them on this example application, none of which I created. So this is an example of just using out-of-the-box custom elements provided by another source. In this case, these are custom elements that Google created for us. We have a GMPX API loader, which is just Google's way of loading all the other code that it needs because Google can't do things in a normal standard way, whatever. And it also passes along the API key, which is probably the most important bit. And then the GMP map element is the map, and the GMP advanced marker, I don't know what a simple marker is, but that's the marker that we actually see on the screen. So these guys are all just display only. And as a result, there's no events that they're sending that we care about. And so I haven't bothered to wrap them. They're just HTML elements on the page that I'm using. So setting up our JavaScript. Sorry, my voice is going to give out if I don't keep hydrated. We just need to import the NPMs that we're actually using to define our custom elements. We bring in the Google Maps, the autocomplete input, that's a thing that I wrote, and then the Phoenix custom event hook, which, like I said, is what provides the bridge between LiveView and custom events. And of course, because we have a hook, we need to actually put it on our socket, so don't forget that little bit. But this is all described in the documentation for LiveElements if you end up using it. So speaking of using LiveElements, this is what it actually looks like to use LiveElements in your LiveView. We pull it in this way with using the custom elements helper, and that gives us our macro. This is the custom element macro. It gets a underscored version of the tag name, and that's what becomes the functional components. And then the other key bit is it gets a list of events that we want to send up to LiveView. In this case, there's only the two I mentioned, search and commit. And yeah, it just creates the functional component and sends the events up to LiveView. In the template, this is the section that actually is the autocomplete. This is using that functional component. It's just like any other Phoenix LiveView functional component. We give it the name, and this is actually the form input name. So if you submitted the form, it would have an airport code in the form data. We give it the initial display value, an ID because we have to, the minimum length to type, and then finally the current set of items that are being displayed, if there are any. Finally, when we are displaying the map, if an airport hasn't been chosen, this is what it looks like. And this is just really plain old LiveView code. There's really not anything much special to see here. We just happen to use some elements that are custom elements for the map. And then inside of the map, we have our marker. And then inside of the marker, we have the actual content that's being rendered for the marker itself. So if you haven't done much with custom elements can have nested content within them, and it's up to the element how the inner content is handled. And there's a whole thing called slots, which takes care of that process. And of course, you're familiar with the idea of slots from LiveView, but it originally comes from custom elements first. All right, so what are some things that you might hit that are challenges with working with LiveView and custom elements? So one big thing to be aware of is LiveView will replace elements often when it renders. And normally that's fine, except when it's not. And so if you look really closely at that demo, you will notice, I don't think I actually selected another airport, but if we did, you might see that like that map might flash because it's being entirely replaced as a new element. So that can be a challenge in some cases depending on the kind of application that you're building. So some workarounds for how you might deal with that. Phoenix update attribute set to ignore will tell LiveView, hey, don't touch this element or any of its descendants except for the data attributes, which then you can use to send data into the custom element. The problem with that, with using that approach, it also means that any of the nested content will not be re-rendered. So if we went back to that example with the map, we have some inner content inside that element for the marker. Well, if you were to set Phoenix update equal to ignore on the outer element, you'd never know when you change the airport because Phoenix is not going to touch things anymore for you. So it's definitely, yeah, an approach that's challenging. You can't really do it that way, essentially. A thing that you can do that works out pretty well, when you render things into a shadow DOM, LiveView cannot reach inside of a shadow DOM. That's the nature of how it works. But again, this can break down when you have slotted or child elements. So if you're using child elements inside of a custom element, you just have to be aware of LiveView is going to, depending on what you're doing, potentially replace that element, and you got to be prepared to deal with that. So some tips for building your own custom element. We've done this quite a bit. It's a great way to wrap an existing library. In our case, one of the ones that we use a lot is full calendar, and we wrap that with a full calendar custom element, and it works out just fine. I would say if you're building custom elements, choosing a library is great, but there's no need, and I would advise against committing to a framework. We like Lit. It's kind of a lightweight library from Google that gives you some nice ergonomics. But the nice thing about custom elements, if you choose one library and you don't like it, you can switch to another library and keep going for your new elements, and your old elements will be just fine. Like, there's no problem. I like to keep my custom elements dumb. I like them to just render their state and dispatch events. So that's kind of the design we follow. One of the last things, if the limitations that I've just described with working with LiveView end up being a deal breaker for you for whatever reason, there's another library called LiveState that I've created that's a whole other topic that I'm not going to go into deeply. But essentially what it does is it lets you have a stateful channel, but the rendering side is then up to you. It's kind of like a LiveView without the rendering. And that can work out if you have like client libs that want to end up subscribing more or less to state at the back end. And it is possible to use LiveState and LiveView together, what you would do in that case. And I do have an example repo. It'll be linked to the slide. You can use an after render hook to pub sub to a LiveState channel that will sync the LiveState state with the LiveView assigns. It sounds a little weird, but it's actually not much, if any, code to do. And essentially what that would let you do is like the front end JavaScript code can then like subscribe to the LiveView assigns. And it will get like notified, and a function will get called anytime the assigns in LiveView changes. So I do have a little tiny demo of that, but I might be out of time. Are they going to pull me off with a hook, or am I okay? All right. I'll show you a little tiny demo. If I can get out of the... Okay. Little tiny demo. So this is a application with the same thing on it twice. It is a plain old generated Phoenix LiveView app with a list of people. And so this is like plain old LiveView generated. And down here, there's a custom element. And this entire piece here is a giant, not giant, but it's just one element. And that element is subscribed to the assigns directly using LiveState. So if I go here and I say, like, here's a person named Fred, and I fill in his stuff, and I say his happiness level is 8 because he's almost done giving his talk, it then appears immediately down here in the list because this is subscribed, this element is subscribed to the assign and knows about it. Vice versa, blob, blob, I can do the same thing up here, and LiveView is going to know about it because I'm sending that event, of course, back up into LiveView. So yeah, the LiveView hook approach I'm just describing is like, you know, there's a GitHub with an example. I don't even have it published to a hex package yet. But if people are interested, I'm happy to do that. Hit me up on GitHub. And yeah, that's pretty much my talk.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the amazing talk. And I think we are out of time for questions, but feel free to ask the questions on Swapcard or just in the hallway track. So next up is Birds of a Feather.